Bonsoir mesdames et messieurs et bienvenue à la dernière séance de la 9e saison de Recherche en Lumière. Nous sommes ravis de pouvoir donner un visage public à la recherche à l'école de musique Schulich. Good evening ladies and gentlemen and welcome to the last session of the 9th season of Research Alive. We're delighted to be able to give a public face to the research at the Schulich School of Music. With this series we aim to bring alive the various kinds of research in and on music with the aim of better understanding the inner workings of the magical world of musical practice and scholarship illustrated with live music and dance. This evening we'll have the first prize winner of the Research Alive student, Ellis Reyes, Montes. This prize is generously funded by Gilles de Villafranca and Dr. David Kostick, who are with us this evening. And all the students get some very excellent coaching from Jill as well, so that's very important. Ellis is a doctoral student in musicology, a bassoonist, and an adept of Peruvian music who will present Guaitinaje, the pipe and tabor player, as dance master and knowledge keeper in the Viceroyalty of Peru. And I should mention that we're already setting up the 10th season of Research Alive for next year, so please stay tuned. And please join me in welcoming Ellis and his Peruvian troupe.
Hi, as we said, my name is Christopher Ellis Alejandro Reyes Montes. I am from Houston, Texas. My mom is from Trujillo, Peru. My grandfather is from Maray, Peru. And my grandmother is from Pucallpa, Peru. My father is from Ballinger, Texas, and we come from a line of Chicanos as well. And so my heritage is both Peruvian and Chicano. I would like to thank the stewards of this land, especially the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, for welcoming me into the First People's House here at McGill and also at Native Montreal. And I also want to thank all the people that made this presentation possible, especially the people involved with Research Alive. Thank you very much. And then also for funding from McGill University, from the Fonds de Recherche Société et Culture Québec, and also from Asociación Rhythm, or the iconography in music. I would also like to thank our different performers today. Right now the dancers are actually still getting ready, so we will actually have them coming onto stage a little bit later. There was a lot of traffic, unfortunately, but they will be here. They are mostly here, actually. So our performers today, we have Leah Weitzner singing voice. We have Jessica Korotkin on cello. We have Stanislas German playing vihuela. And then we have Namgon Lee playing percussion. And like I said, our performers, our dancers will actually be from the Asociación Cultural Baila, Conmigo, Canada, and they're led by Evelyn Ynocente. Yeah, you can stay. I also wanted to say a quick note. So on the presentation slides, I went ahead and had translation, especially help from my mom, Sandra Montes. Most of the slides have been translated, and the stuff that is coming from primary sources will be in original spelling. So you might see baile with a Y, or you'll see bello with a V. You know, they look like misspelled words in modern Spanish. So if they are translated, then they are in modern Spanish. If they are from the primary sources, they will be in original spelling. I want to make sure that my grandparents and my mom know that I know how to spell. So it's there. All right, so the core of this presentation will be discussing that the pipe and tabor player is the dance master and knowledge keeper in the Viceroyalty of Peru. And in this presentation, we will look at the historical and cultural context of the Codex Trujillo, and then we will also look at the pipe and tabor technique as it occurs throughout the Codex and also in other contexts, especially in South America and a little bit in Europe as well. Throughout this lecture, we will have a few performances of Taki, which is a form of indigenous storytelling through song and dance, and that's where we will be having our musicians and our dancers, and we'll be putting this whole collaboration together. So you might be asking, what are the pipe and tabor? And this is something that has always fascinated me for many years, and I'm really glad to have gotten this opportunity to be able to research and to actually learn how to play these instruments, and now to be able to perform and be able to share it with many more people. So the pipe and tabor are two different instruments that are played simultaneously by the same person. So the pipe is like a recorder instrument, and when you play it in its fundamental range, it sounds like a recorder. But the way that the instrument is voiced is to where it actually prioritizes the higher register, so you can actually have different harmonics playing. And through that, we add 3 finger holes, and you can play a scale. And these pipes can be tuned in different ways. So there's some that are in Lydian mode, some that are in major mode, some that are in minor mode. We're not going to get into too much detail, although 3 of the pipes that I have are in different scales. So if you're really keen on watching my fingers, you can kind of see which fingerings I'll be using. Now this, of course, lets you actually play everything with just one hand. So again, like, I can play this all with one hand. And then this leaves my other hand free to be able to play a tabor. Now, for the context of this performance, the tabor is basically a snare drum. It is a drum that has skins usually on both sides of the frame, and then it also has a gut snare on it. The difference between this and a modern snare drum is that generally we like for the snare to actually make more of a buzz that sustains for a longer time. And so as a result, you can actually have a drone that actually plays for a longer time, and it provides almost like a background for the musician. So if I put it together, so this is a Renaissance tune that uses like the pipe and tabor, and so that's kind of how you can use both at the same time. So now let's look more at the Codex Trujillo. And first I wanted to start with this picture. It's a watercolor, and it comes from this codex, and it actually shows the pipe and tabor being used in dance. So first we can talk about the actual codex itself. The Codex Trujillo del Peru was compiled at the end of the 18th century by Bishop Baltasar Jaime Martinez Compañón, and it contains many depictions of lots of different things. We'll go into more detail about that later, but the most important thing for this presentation is that it has many depictions of the pipe and tabor. And in terms of collections, this is the one that actually has probably the most biased amount of pipe and tabor depictions compared to other collections of iconography for music. If we look at this more closely, though, we can actually see that there's much more going on than just the fact that there's a pipe and tabor player in this depiction here. So if we look at the top, we have 5 different people that are featured in the front. The top row, the first 2 people, are dressed in ponchos, just like what I'm wearing here. This is mine, and this is a traditional clothing that we have in the Andes. So this is in Peru, Bolivia, Chile, and in Ecuador especially. So we have this outfit that we wear, and this goes back many centuries before. The people on the bottom are actually wearing capes, and they're also wearing button-down shirts. Now here we have a depiction already of costume that is influenced by European fashion in this case. So we have both Andean wear and European wear happening in the same dance. One other thing to point out is that all of the dancers, except for the pipe and tabor player, which is strange for this collection, they're actually wearing little jingles on their ankles as well. And this is usually a sign that they're also dancers, because it's a way that they can actually use the jingles to emphasize their dance as they're going along. Lastly, of course, we have the pipe and tabor player that is accompanying this dance. So we have here a scene that's about dance. We're using the pipe and tabor that's accompanying this dance, and it's something that shows both the combination of indigenous and European influences. Also, we can say that this is happening in the public because in the top left corner, we actually see many people that are kind of gathered both on the bottom, and then there's also like a little balcony where there's even more people that are kind of spectating there. So now let's zoom out a little bit and go further. I wanted to provide a historical context and talk a little bit more about the colonization of Peru, because this will help us understand what is exactly going on. And of course, I think really importantly, because this was even difficult for me to envision, was kind of where we are geographically. So if we look right here, we have North and South America that are here, or just America in Spanish. And Peru is this country that's right here in South America. It's on the Pacific coast of South America. And it's kind of, if you see like South America, it has like this bump, and it's on the left-hand side or in the west. So when the Spaniards arrived, they went through the Caribbean, and then they sailed. Then after they got to the coast, then they kind of got onto land, and they kind of progressed downwards towards what's modern-day Peru. And in 1532, Francisco Pizarro captures Atahualpa, who was the last Inca emperor. And after he captures him, he executes him. He captures him in the north of Peru, in the city that's called Cajamarca. If you see on this line here, we have the city Cajamarca, and that's where Pizarro captured Atahualpa. And then afterwards, he actually parades Atahualpa through until he gets to Cusco, which is the capital of the Inca Empire, or Tawantinsuyu. And that's where he then executes him. Of course, by executing the final Inca, that effectively ends the Inca Empire. And a few years later, the Spanish crown establishes the Viceroyalty of Peru in 1542. And this is actually a depiction here on the left. We have Francisco Pizarro and another one of his soldiers that are preparing to leave Spain and go to South America. And they have his trusty pipe and tabor player accompanying him there. And then in 1572, so a couple of decades afterwards, we have Tupac Amaru, who leads a revolt against the colonial government, but then afterwards he is also captured, and then he is executed as well. And so one of the important things to note, though, is that both Atahualpa and Tupac Amaru were executed in different ways, but eventually there became this tradition just a few years later in I don't have the date here, but in the, like 1612, that's when these depictions show that Atahualpa was beheaded, even though the documents show that that wasn't actually the case. So we get this tradition of retelling the story of Atahualpa and Tupac Amaru as having almost the same life and as having the same death. And this will be something that we'll talk a little bit more about later on. So then we'll fast forward a bit. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, the colonial government actually exerts more power and structure, governance, something that Spaniards love to do and no longer like to do nowadays. And then the church as well also exerted a lot more control in the Viceroyalty of Peru. So this was, again, the representation of the Spanish crown in South America. And then in 1779, Martínez Compañón becomes the bishop of Trujillo. So Martínez Compañón was born in Spain, and then afterwards he was sent to Peru, to the north of Peru, to become the bishop of the diocese of Trujillo, which again is in the northern part of the country nowadays. And I just wanted to show in this left-hand picture, this is from the Codex Trujillo, so this is from the 1780s, and it shows indigenous students, indigenous seminarians. So this was a way that the Spaniards had already exerted more control. They actually offered indigenous people, one of the ways to actually be more upwardly mobile in society was to become a seminarian and then to join the church. That was one of the main ways. And so here we have seminarians that are most likely celebrating a graduation, or maybe they passed their comps, and they're celebrating and they're accompanied by a pipe and tabor player as they're dancing in front of the seminary. So again, this is already where we have this blending of indigenous and European influences. And then on the right here, we have Bishop Martínez Compañón. This is one of his better self-portraits. He has another one that's not quite so nice. So now we can zoom in more on the Codex Trujillo itself. So the full title, or at least the way that most Spanish scholars or Spanish-speaking scholars call it, is the Codex Trujillo del Perú. It's more Anglophone scholars who actually use the term Codex Martínez Compañón. Because most of the sources that I've used for this have been Spanish speakers, I choose to use Codex Trujillo del Perú. And then of course also, since my mom is from Trujillo, I just think it's a little bit closer to home for that. So like I said, this was compiled in the 1780s, and it contains 9 volumes. In the second volume, we actually have the one that's more interesting for our presentation. But in the, there are 3 volumes that are about the plants, there are 3 volumes about the animals, and then there's 3 volumes that are a little bit more about everything else that deals with like, culture and society and stuff like that. Volume 2 contains depictions of everyday life, and it even shows like people of different castes and different racial backgrounds. It contains depictions of music making and of Taki, which again is the indigenous storytelling through song and dance. It also contains 17 depictions of the pipe and tabor, which again is quite a lot for any collection of depictions here. And if we see here on the right, we actually have one of the other pipe and tabor depictions here where he's accompanying the dance of the birds, or the danza de pájaros. In addition to the depictions, there's also 20 notated pieces of music. And one of the important things to think about is that these pieces, the way that they're notated, of course, they do have rhythms, they have time signatures, key signatures. If you look at this example here at the top, it says it's for violin, it's 2/4, we have a sharp, maybe it's E minor, maybe it's G major, or maybe it's like F sharp Locrian or something. But we have, we have the information already given. We can perform it. It says allegro. We have all this information to perform it as if we're, approaching other kind of European music from this time period. However, Gabriel Garrido suggests that we should think of this more as a written recording. So basically, rather than it just being like a strict piece of music that a composer wants to have interpreted in a specific way, it could be more a transcription of what people were hearing. On top of this, let me not get ahead of myself actually, because this is going to be later on in the presentation, but just keep that in mind, written recording. I also thought this was pretty cool, this picture of indigenous people playing cards right here in the middle. So this is just another everyday thing that's just showing. And this one is really interesting because we can also see that there's, again, it is labeled that they are indigenous, but they're wearing European influenced clothing, like again, the button-down coat. They're wearing very European influenced kinds of clothing, but then they also have feathers in their hair, which is probably more indigenous influence. But then they're playing European cards. And if you look really closely, they're actually very similar to the Southern European cards that are used still today in Spain and Italy. So now we can go into more detail about the depictions of Taki. So like I said, many of the depictions in the Codex Trujillo in the second volume are showing Taki, or this sort of storytelling. And that means that each one of these watercolors is one that we should actually try to see what is the story that's going on. There are some of these that actually have a very specific story, a very clear one for us to follow. For example, this one, which is called the Danza de la Degollación del Inca, or the Dance of the Beheading of the Inca. This is the one that's going to be telling about the last moments of the Inca emperor. And this is one of 2 watercolors. The first one here shows a little bit more of an idyllic scene. The Inca is in his throne. He has people that are attending to him. There's even people that are dreaming, that are playing cards, probably doing some, not playing cards, but they're playing, they're dreaming, they're sleeping, they're probably doing some divination. There's a lot of different things going on here that suggest that the first part of this dance was more about showing the Inca Empire at its height before the Spaniards arrive and capture the Inca and execute him. In this other picture here, we have the Danza de Espadas. There are several depictions of these, and unfortunately, we don't have that much information that helps us understand what's going on here. But at the very least, we can think more that, again, these musicians, these dancers, and the pipe and tabor player appear to be indigenous. One of the ways that I can usually tell is that the European people in this codex are usually drawn as almost entirely white, and they almost always have makeup, so they almost always have like some rosy cheeks on them, for example. Whereas most other people of other castes are usually drawn like this color, like more brown, more red. And then there's also depictions of black people who are usually drawn as black or very dark brown. So in this picture here, though, we have indigenous dancers who are wearing very much European clothing. They're dancing with swords. So it could be something where they're either trying to recreate something European, maybe they're doing something like a bourrée or a contredanse or some other kind of dance that they've learned from Europeans, or they might have even be doing something that's satirical to European dance. And we'll talk about that more later. The other thing is that these different taki are accompanied by different kinds of instruments. Now, the one obviously that I'm going to be focusing the most on are the pipe and tabor, but as you probably saw at the beginning, we had a few where they had violins, they had vihuelas, they had lots of different instruments that they used. Interestingly, though, most of the time, most of the music making that happens here is not the typical kind that we associate with cathedral musicians or even with European musicians. There's very little string instruments that are represented, and there's very little things like other sorts of formal Baroque music instruments that we associate with that time period. One more important thing to know about the taki is that a lot of times there are different melodies that are associated with different dances or different situations. So, of course, this makes sense if we think about songs with words, because then we can think, okay, the story is going to be in the words. However, we have several documents that show that people also conceived of these melodies as evoking melodies just on their own, and that even an instrumentalist could actually invoke this in their own playing. For example, this is from Mercurio Peruano. I'm not 100% sure if this is just a made-up person or if it's like an actual person with that name. But he says, ¿Qué persona que no se conmueva solo con el oír tocar su aire en un mero instrumento? Or who wouldn't be moved by hearing one's breath or melody played by a mere instrument? And we have several other examples of this sort of sentiment as well expressed in this. Also, we can tell, again, in these sorts of pictures that we have different kinds of situations going on here. For example, Danza del Purap. Unfortunately, we don't know what Purap means anymore. We've lost that to time. But at the very least, we can see that there's somebody with a corn husk and somebody else with a staff that apparently is an imitation of having like a staff of, that actually almost looked like the staff of Dionysius, where you would have like an artichoke or something at the top of it. It's a very similar thing, probably, again, European syncretism going on with an indigenous festival. And here, so this is probably some kind of harvest dance or harvest festival, something to kind of celebrate that. And then on the right, we have the dance of the monkeys. And again, we don't know too much about this, but you know, they're dressed up like monkeys, and even the pipe and tabor player is dressed as a monkey in this case. But it seems that they're out in the countryside because we have like a little bit more natural scenery going on back there, and there's something more like a shack that's kind of depicted there on the side there where somebody gets some water. Now we can talk a little bit more about the notated pieces of music. One of the really important things about these pieces is that most of them actually tell us where they're from or what they're supposed to sound like. So for example, this one, Alegro tonada el tupamaro cajamarca. This tells us that it's a tonada, which is a type of dance or a type of song, basically, and that it comes from the city of Cajamarca, which, like we pointed out before, is in the north of Peru, and this is where Atahualpa was captured. Also, the title of this piece shows this fusing of characters, because again, Atahualpa was captured in Cajamarca, but the name Tupac Amaru is put as the title, or Tupamaro in this case. So that's again showing that there's this blending already going on in this tradition of retelling the story. Now, if we look at the bottom here, we have another piece that's called Cachua a voz y bajo al nacimiento de Cristo nuestro Señor. This is an example of a sacred piece that's contained in this collection. There are some pieces that are sacred and some that are secular. The top one is obviously secular because it's talking about the Inca emperor, but this bottom one is talking about at the birth of Jesus Christ, in which case this would be talking about Christmas. And so this is something that's religious and that corresponds to that. Now, one more thing that I wanted to emphasize also in the Codex Trujillo is that there seems to be a political undertone throughout the entire thing, and especially in this second volume. The reason why is because we actually have most of the musicians that are actually from different castes that aren't just white Europeans. So when we have depictions of like angel musicians, for example, they're usually depicted as white, they're usually depicted playing only European instruments, and these are the kinds of iconography that you see in actual churches. But in this collection, we have people from different castes that aren't usually represented in the iconography. On top of that, in our sung pieces, we actually have texts that criticize slavery. For example, here's an excerpt from the Tonada El Congo, which says, "A la mar me llevan sin tener razón," or "they take me to the sea without any reason." And so this is one that is told from the perspective of an enslaved person, talking about their experiences. And we have to think that why would the bishop allow for something that criticizes this fundamental part of, colonial Peruvian society to be in this document that was sent off to Spain? And then, of course, we have these different retellings of the stories of Atahualpa and of Tupac Amaru. Again, we're glorifying these people that were the enemies of the Spanish crown in a document that's compiled for Spain. And then on top of that, we even have depictions of suffering. And for me, this is the most disturbing image from the Codex. I get really, just awful feelings every time I see it. And this is a combination of different feelings that I get. The main one is it just, it taps into that kind of trypophobia or whatever. But this is somebody that's suffering from smallpox, which is one of the deadliest diseases that affected indigenous populations all over the Americas, and that probably contributed most to the colonization of pretty much the entire North and South America. So we have this depiction here of this sort of suffering, which again, it's very interesting that these would be included in a document that was meant to be sent off to Spain. So now I would like to check and see if we have our dancers back here real quick. Que si pueden... Like I said before, this is the Asociación Cultural Baila, Conmigo, Canada. So let me just explain these two pieces that we're going to do first, and then afterwards we'll go ahead and do our first dance. So our first Taki consists of two pieces. The first one is called the Baile del Chimo, which, again, Chimo is the historical spelling. Nowadays we say Chimu with a U. The Chimu were actually a tribe of people that complied with the colonial government throughout the colonial era in Peru. In addition, they probably actually helped in some way give the Spanish power in that. So what we're using this piece to do is to show that there are European influences in the piece. For example, it reflects more of a Pavan-style rhythm in its setting. And I will actually be ornamenting using traditional Spanish-style ornaments to kind of show the different style. And then after that, we'll have a quick transition to go into the Tonada El Tupamaro de Cajamarca, like I talked about before. This talks about the final moments of the Inca before execution. And in this case, we will have Leah actually being the personification of this Inca that is going to be executed in this dance. So we can go ahead and come up here. Pues se pueden sentar ahí si quieren, sí. Pueden pasar por aquí. So looking at these depictions of the pipe and tabor in South America, probably the first thing that comes to mind, and the first one that came to my mind, was actually thinking about the European versions. And of course, knowing that South America was colonized by the Spanish, of course, then we think about what were the Spaniards doing with the pipe and tabor. In one of the earliest pieces of notated music that we have, the Cantigas de Santa Maria, we actually have depictions of pipe and tabor players who were just depicted. I don't know exactly what they were doing, but it seems that these were kind of instruments that were used to accompany those pieces from the 12th century. Additionally, we have different kinds of depictions that kind of tell us what were these instruments being used for in these different contexts. However, I would say that most of the times they're being used for dance music. We generally only have pipe and tabor being shown for different kinds of dance. However, we do have different kinds of depictions as well. So oftentimes we'll have some angel musicians playing different pipes and tabors as well. And then another really popular tradition that's still being practiced today in the north of Spain, in the Basque country, is actually the use of the pipe and the string drum. So that's this one here, this angel that's on the right-hand side. They're playing both the pipe and then the string drum, which kind of produces a different kind of drone. Earlier in the history, though, we did have a little bit more of an association of the pipe and tabor with military, which is something that I've been learning about very recently. So basically, earlier in history, the pipe and tabor player could have been somebody that actually was at the front of an army to direct them into battle. So for example, here we have a depiction of a pipe and tabor player who's leading an army from Aragon to some kind of battle. However, as the armies got bigger and as people started using larger drums, they noticed that the pipe and tabor, the pipe wasn't loud enough to be able to accompany that. So that's when they switched more to the fife, which is another flute that's used and generally has more piercing of a sound. And that's where we'll get probably a more familiar iconography of having a drum player and a transverse fife player accompanying a battle. Of course, if you are from the United States, you probably think of like the Revolutionary War as one of those examples of that, but I'm sure there's other Canadian and other kinds of depictions that come to mind as well for that. However, I have wanted to talk more about how when the Spaniards came to South America, they actually introduced this pipe and tabor into an existing tradition that goes back millennia even in South America. And first, in order to talk about this more, I would like to introduce this concept of the pipe and tabor technique. This is a term that was coined by Charles Boiles in 1966, and it describes the simultaneous playing of a flute instrument and a drum instrument together. And this way, you can actually use this approach to talk about other kinds of pipe and tabor, or at least things that resemble this. So again, in the previous icon, we had these angel musicians. If we just kept the strict definition of pipe and tabor, then we wouldn't really be able to talk about the string drum in the same sort of thing, even though the technique is quite similar in practice. And so, for example, here we have a depiction of a musician from a Nazca culture, which dates to around 200 BCE to 600 CE. There we go. That's why I wrote them down. And this person is actually playing two rattles. According to one scholar, they actually described that it looks like his feet might be damaged or even amputated, and he's actually playing a rattle that's attached to his knee, in addition to a rattle that's closer to his head. And he's playing the panpipes, or the antara, at the same time. This is actually a common technique that we see throughout pre-contact iconography. We have this one here that's playing an antara as well, which is again the panpipes and playing the drum at the same time. This is from the Chincha culture, which is dating between the 11th century to the 15th century. And then we even have another player. Now we're departing from the drum. We actually have a player playing the antara and a rattle at the same time, or jingles. So again, these are different manifestations of this pipe and tabor technique that exists in South America in many different cultures. And these are ones that date even further and further back in time. One thing that I want to also stress is that in these different pictures of these different musicians, they're most often depicted wearing very elaborate and detailed clothing. Oftentimes, these are things that we might associate more with somebody that's either a shaman or a priest or some other sacred or important official function in these different societies. So for example, this one here, he has like, there's kind of this lapel that's very heavily decorated with lots of traditional patterns that we see throughout throughout South American iconography. And then in this one here, we have somebody that's wearing this very elaborate sort of like necklace, like necklaces upon necklaces basically, and wearing a fancy hat. And as we all know, fancy hats tell us a lot about the importance of someone. So, but anyways, like that's something that's really interesting to see in this iconography. And generally when you do have a musician that's playing both at the same time, they're dressed in this sort of way. To go even further into this, I want to introduce a myth that was recorded in the 17th century in the province of Huarochiri, which is closer to Lima in Peru, so a little bit more towards the center of modern-day Peru. But I think it's still applicable to this situation. And so the myth of Huatiacuri talks about how Huatiacuri, who's the son of Pariacaca, who's actually a representation of a major mountain in Peru, Huatiacuri married a woman, and then the woman's brother challenges Huatiacuri to a duel of music and of dancing and of drinking, but we won't talk about the drinking part. Now, when Huatiacuri got that challenge, he asked Pariacaca, his father, how can I superar, how can I achieve or do this? He goes out, and Pariacaca tells him, you need to go out into the wilderness and you'll find everything you need for this challenge. So Huatiacuri goes out into the wilderness and he finds a skunk and a fox who actually bring an antara, the panpipes, the drum, and also a bucket of chicha because you need good drink, I guess, to play music. But anyway, so he sees these three things, and what he does is he scares away the skunk and the fox. They run away, but they leave behind these special objects with them. So he picks up these instruments, and then he goes with his wife to his brother-in-law's house where they're going to challenge him. And when he gets there, they're already drinking, they're already partying, they're already like celebrating. And one important detail is that there's like almost 200 women that are playing drums that are accompanying this sort of thing. Additionally, then, Huatiacuri's wife walks in, she plays the drum, like she starts playing, and then Huatiacuri picks up the antara and starts playing it. And what happens is described that the entire earth moved and danced with him as he was playing the antara. Now, of course, there's not really much else to say, but obviously he won the challenge against his brother-in-law. They did a few other challenges. It's kind of like a little bit like the tale of the deeds of Hercules. But basically, so there's this story that talks about these details that show us the gendering of different instruments. So in this pre-contact society and in early Inca, or at least in the very late Inca society, generally men played the antara and women played drums. And we see this in other iconography, especially from the 17th and 18th centuries as well. And so for me, as a gay man, as someone that actually exists in these different kind of spaces, not always in heteronormative, not always in a very binary sort of way, I find that this pipe and tabor technique actually represents the Inca version of the Kariwarmi, which is the man-woman, or we could even say the two-spirit. This is a role that used to be very important for the creation of society and the creation of culture. It was basically described that if somebody were to actually embody these two things, it is like having the male and the female to be able to create and engender other things into society. And so somebody that plays both the pipe and tabor in these earlier depictions for me is probably somebody that is sacred and somebody who is actually working to create more society and to forward their society and to impart tradition as we move forward. And so it was just something that I want to think more about just in general as I see the pipe and tabor in South America, especially when looking at these sorts of, again, people that are dressed in very interesting clothing that are probably playing the flute and the percussion instrument at the same time, probably doing something important for their own societies there. One more thing that I wanted to say about this practice of the South American, especially the panpipe playing and the drum together, is that this is something that continues forward. Now, in my research so far, I haven't seen depictions from earlier than the 19th century that show this. So there's kind of a gap between like the 17th century, or the 16th century and the 19th century, but I'm certain that one day I will find something, or maybe somebody else has already found them. But at the very least, in the early 19th century, we already have depictions of people playing, again, the drums and the panpipes in South America, continuing this existing tradition that goes back at least 2,000 years. And even nowadays, we have people still celebrating this. This is called a sicuri or sicuriada. There's lots of different variations of this term, but it's basically troops of people who play the panpipes and the drum at the same time for different ceremonial or sacred functions. So now we can go back to the Codex Trujillo and look at now this mixing, this contact between European and indigenous cultures. And I think the piece that kind of emphasizes this the most in the Codex Trujillo is this one. It has a very long title, and it's one of the shortest pieces. It's the Baile de danzantes con pífano y tamboril. So pífano y tamboril. Pífano is the pipe, tamboril is the tabor. Se bailará entre 4 u 8 u más, con espada en mano o pañuelos. So it's already describing people dancing in groups of 4s or 8s or even more, and they're holding either a sword in their hand or even handkerchiefs. And it is done in forma de contradanza. It is done in the form of a contradance, which, as we know, is a very popular dance that exists throughout Europe in the 17th, 18th, and even 19th century, I believe. So this piece suggests heavily that there is this European influence already happening in this sort of music. This is also the only piece that's in the Codex that actually specifies the pipe and tabor. So I think that's an important thing to consider. But this can also point possibly to a satirical dance. So nowadays, in modern traditional Peruvian dance, we have this piece that's called the Contradanza de Huamachuco. And this is one that satirizes European dance steps and is part of a corpus of dances that are actually used to satirize different kinds of aspects. We have one that satirizes waltz. This is one that satirizes more the contradance. And I'm sure that there's other ones that I have yet to learn about. And so in our interpretation of this piece, we're about to do this. I'm going to be taking the tempo a little bit slower than how most people play this piece, so that way it can line up more with this contradanza. And our dancers will actually be using these steps from the contradanza de Huamachuco, or at least some elements of them, in order to kind of make this piece come to life here. So we will go ahead and get ready here. ¿Alguien más? Okay. And so now in the last part of this presentation, I would just like to focus now a little bit more, now that we've talked about the different kind of cultural contexts and different things, now focusing exclusively on the pipe and tabor in the Viceroyalty of Peru. The first depiction of the pipe and tabor being played in South America comes from the 1615 chronicle by Felipe Guamán Poma de Ayala, and it shows indigenous musicians and dancers who are playing in front of the Holy Sacraments in a church. Now, this is one of the examples of the many examples that we have that actually show that indigenous people were actually employed many times to play music in the churches. Generally, the highest level or the most exclusive level that was talking about like very strict kinds of liturgical chant were usually reserved only for priests or only for European-born people. But for most of the other kinds of music that were generally given to instrumentalists or of things that weren't exclusive to like priestly roles, these were oftentimes opened up to indigenous musicians. And like I said before, this was actually an opportunity for musicians to be able to have some kind of mobility in their own lives. So in this one, we have these musicians that are playing and dancing in front of the sacraments. Now this is more of the detail of this pipe and tabor player. And I went ahead and highlighted the different parts because it's very difficult to see it in here. But basically the musician has a pipe that I've labeled in blue, and he has a tabor drum that's in orange with a little beater for the drum that's in green there. Now this is an example of the musician as being this knowledge keeper who combines indigenous ceremony, music, and dance with the European Christianity, the European ritual, and music as well. So this is, again, where we have these indigenous musicians that are actually working to combine these different things and that they're actually communicating in between these two different spaces. Now, if we fast forward to the end of the 18th century, we have different depictions of the pipe and tabor in the Codex Trujillo. And one of the important parts is that we actually have these depictions showing musicians from different castes or different racial backgrounds playing the pipe and tabor. So here on the left, we have this Danza de los 12 Pares de Francia, which is a traditional kind of dance. It actually sounds very similar in choreography to the contradanza, and it's one that talks about Charlemagne, actually, which is really interesting that there's kind of this tradition that exists even in the 1700s. But basically, we can probably assume that these are most likely going to be European or criollo, who are also Europeans that were born in South America, musicians and dancers that were showing off this taki or this sort of dance. Then in the middle here, we have people that are dressed, indigenous people that are dressed in more indigenous clothing, so ones that kind of lack those sort of European influences that we've seen in other depictions. And here, even in the depiction here, it says that these are indigenous people from the mountains. And they're actually dressed, again, in these very elaborate clothing. And they're also playing the panpipes and the pipe and tabor together in this ensemble. So this is an example of a more stricter indigenous sort of interpretation with the pipe and tabor. Now this last one, I do not want to say this out loud, I'll just translate it. It's something that's kind of become a racist term nowadays. But this is the dance of Africans, basically, and this is an example where we actually have black dancers and a black pipe and tabor player at the bottom there. And to kind of really nail this point down, we actually have a European nobleman, and this is very specifically a European nobleman because, again, they're wearing makeup that makes them even whiter, and they have like the blush in their cheeks. In the first volume of the Codex, we actually have depictions of individual nobility that are very detailed in this way. But then we have these black dancers that are not only dancing, but also demonstrating that they're still serving this European person that's walking among them. But this is to say, again, that the pipe and tabor kind of transcends or permeates into all these different castes and different backgrounds. So it's ubiquitous in the Codex Trujillo. Sorry, I just need to grab a drink of water. So this last piece is one that I think can kind of tie a lot of my argument in this presentation together. So we're going to look at the Tonada El Conejo, which is actually one of the pieces that has a corresponding depiction or one that seems to correspond to the music. So we have this danza del conejo right here on the left, and we have people dressed in, supposedly these are rabbits. They're very strange looking rabbits. Anyway, so they're dancing with pañuelos, with handkerchiefs, and they're accompanied, of course, by a pipe and tabor player. It seems that they're out in a field because they have grass that's depicted, and then they also have a very simple looking shack that's kind of in the background as well. Now this is an interesting melody because I find that it actually works really well on the pipe and tabor. So if we look at the music here, we have, that's a D and an F sharp. This is in soprano clef. But so it's a D, F sharp, D, D, A. So these are notes that correspond to a triad. And on a pipe that can actually emphasize, my pipes are kind of strange, but for this example here, I could do all of that with just not changing the fingering. So for me, this kind of suggests that at least this was kind of an inspiration for this melody, was probably a tabor pipe, because it's just this very like chord based. And it kind of just alternates, especially in the dance section, between just 1 and 5 and 1 and 5, something that's much easier to do on a pipe and tabor than say on a recorder or on a violin, for example, where they can do lots more chromaticism and lots of different kinds of things. The narrow range also lends itself really well to the pipe and tabor. Now, of course, the biggest question I'm sure that many of y'all had was, why did I pick the word Guaitinaje as the title of this presentation? For me, Guaitinaje, I think most likely represents or talks about the pipe and tabor player itself. So again, if we look at the dance section of this piece, that's when you have these words Guaitinaje appearing. So there's an excerpt from the piece, the actual score. So it says Guaitinaje, Guaitinaje. It shows up so many times in there, and it shows up in the dance section. So again, we have this depiction that shows dancers with a pipe and tabor player, and then we have this dance piece that also talks about Guaitinaje, most likely also referencing the pipe and tabor player. Additionally, for me, sorry about that. The most, for me, what kind of makes me really think that this corresponds to the pipe and tabor is that in Latin American Spanish, we actually have many different instruments that are described as reed instruments that get repurposed as regular wind instruments without reeds. So for example, the zampoña or sampoña in Italy, or even in Southern Europe, actually refers to a bagpipe. But in Peru, we call the zampoña a panpipe. It's one of the many words we have for panpipe in Peruvian Spanish. The next one is dulzaina, or dulzaina, in Spain refers to a sham of some sort, which probably relates to the dulcian, or like the bassoon. But then in Ecuador, the dulzaina actually refers to a type of recorder instrument, again with no reeds. Then we have the chirimia. The chirimia in Spain is the basic word for sham, like just for Renaissance sham or any kind of sham. And also in parts of Latin America, the chirimia is used as a sham. But the chirimia also refers to a genre of music that doesn't have shams in it at all, and oftentimes it has transverse flutes instead of reeded instruments. And so then the last one of these examples would be the word gaita, which could also be spelled as guaita. And gaita in Spain refers to a type of bagpipe, but in Ecuador, it refers to a transverse flute, and in Colombia, it refers to a tabor pipe, a pipe that is actually played with a maraca as an accompaniment, and this is a foundation of a genre of dance that's also called gaita. And so using this sort of linguistic evidence and combining it with the iconography, I can say that Guaitinaje most likely refers to the pipe and tabor in this piece. The last thing, which I didn't talk about that much in this because it's something that I'm less familiar with, but this music here actually shows some influence of African music in it as well. So the main melody of this piece kind of has more of a 3 feel to it, but then the bass part generally has more of a 6 or 2 feel to it. So we already have these 2 different rhythms that are kind of layered on top of each other. And so that's something that we're going to be playing around with more in our musical interpretation, where we have several of us doing different kinds of rhythms throughout. And this is also a way that it emulates more of our modern Afro-Peruvian music, which actually has a lot of these layerings of different kinds of rhythms. Additionally, for this piece, it comes in two sections. The first section is one that is more of a protest song against the colonial government. It says that a Lord Feliz de Soto actually puts a tariff or a ban on tobacco sales, and he says for people to take away anybody that would try to sell tobacco, basically. So again, affecting negatively the economy in the time. Then the last thing is that after this sort of protest song, then there's this love song about a bunny, and it's very weird. And it's just a dance. It's almost kind of a little frivolous kind of dance. And so this, for me, as a Latino man, kind of reminds me of what Ricky Martin has said before in one of his very famous songs that says, "Bailando todo se arregla," or dancing, everything fixes itself. And so in this last piece, we would like to go ahead and demonstrate this sort of combination through the tonada El Conejo. Just very quickly, I wanted to just, again, reiterate everything. So through this iconography and through the performance, we have demonstrated that the pipe and tabor player is the dance master and knowledge keeper in the Viceroyalty of Peru. The Codex Trujillo shows how the instruments lead Taki and communicate tradition between European, indigenous, and African influences, and that all of these traditions continue to endure to this day all around South America. And we're very blessed to be able to have many people here that are able to bring these traditions to life again here on stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ellis, and thanks so much to your wonderful musicians and fantastic dancers. It's really
Thank
good.
you.
We do have time for some questions right now, so we have a Q&A at this point. If anybody has any, let's see if anybody came over the...
Yes?
Yeah, I have maybe, well, thank you very much for this.
Oh, thank you.
I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about the context of this codex, if we know why it was compiled, who was the target audience.
Sure. So in the 1770s and 80s, King Charles III, I forgot if it's third or fourth, he actually commands that people from the colonies start actually documenting what's going on in these different places. And so most likely Bishop Martinez Compagnon actually starts this project when he becomes a bishop and starts trying to document everything that's going on. In the first volume, there's actually a little bit more of maps of the diocese. The second volume also includes census data and also language information. And then the final volume also includes different iconography showing the archaeological expeditions that they did and also pieces that they were planning on shipping back to Spain. I don't know if those pieces got back to Spain, but the codex did arrive to Spain. And I think those are the main points of that. But basically it was kind of an effort that was kind of that was begun by the crown, and then afterwards the bishop continued that through this. And like I said, it's very interesting that he decides to not only do a census and maps, but then also show like this is everyday life, this is music making, here's some pieces that they're doing. And so I find that to be just the most unique part about this codex.
Any other questions?
Thank you, Ellis. That was really amazing.
Thank you.
So do you think that the Codex Trujillo was actually made by Europeans or indigenous artists and scribes? Or do you think it was that was also kind of a mix?
That part I'm not 100% sure about. We do know that many indigenous people were actually taught how to paint. So actually what we call the Cusco School of Painting, which is kind of the Spanish influenced school that exists in South America, actually was mostly done by indigenous artists. And so many of the depictions that we have of, again, angel musicians, of, processions and stuff like that, they actually are indigenous musicians, indigenous painters, that are actually doing this sort of thing. So there's a big chance that there are also indigenous people that were working with the bishop to actually make these watercolors. However, they're not quite as detailed as the Cusco School of Painting, so they might not have been trained as much in doing these sort of paintings. And we even see like some really ugly portraits of some of the nobility throughout. And it's hard to tell if this is just an error on the part of the artist or if it's an actual intentional way of depicting the nobility. But so there's that. As for the music part, there are several errors throughout the different pieces. There are some that are obvious errors, like where you have just dissonances that make no sense. But then there's other ones that seem to be more either indicative of this is a heard kind of thing, so they just transcribed what they heard, or that they just didn't have the notation to show kind of what exactly was going on. For example, there's this one dance that everything happens on the second beat, and there's just always rests on the downbeats, and that's very strange for European music, but for some reason somebody decided to do that. One of the parts that has been really interesting to me, and also to Leah as well, has been looking at the actual text setting, because it's hard to tell if these were done by non-native Spanish speakers, because there's a lot of times when, so like the word unión, for example, in this last song, it's actually set as unión, which is, nobody does this as far as I know, I've never seen that ever written in any Spanish song before, even in modern day when we have, so there's a lot of artists nowadays, like my mom, for example, where she will also set a syllable off from the downbeat, but it's part of a kind of an unspoken tradition that we have of setting Spanish in song. So it's hard to tell if some of these are examples of that sort of thing, or if it's done by non-native speaker, or if it's a combination of both, or if it's this thing that kind of confused me, the idea of the illiterate scribe, of somebody that was just putting syllables in random places or just trying to match notes up. It's hard to tell, but yeah, so. Thank you.
So since the monarch was mandated the bishop or other functionaries to do this codex, I would assume that there were other areas were mandated to do a codex too. Do we have any surviving examples of other codexes?
That I don't know, unfortunately. That can be probably somewhere that I expand on my dissertation.
That is my question. How are you going to put this in your dissertation?
Well, thank you. I think that there's many other aspects that I haven't been able to talk about in this. For example, going more into colonial theory, for example, or post-colonial theory, talking about how actually these, not only are there these influences that are being combined, but there's also a communication aspect of them as well. And I like what a theologian, Hershey Mallet-Stevens, often says, that, well, she specifically talks about in the United States, but I think this can be applied especially in the rest of the colonized world, that pretty much every conversation, and in this case, written down conversation, is a discussion of race as well. And I think that's something that I could probably discuss or learn more about through studying the Codex, but then also other contemporary documents from this time period as well. There's lots of chronicles, like we looked at the Mercurio Peruano, for example, which is from the 1790s, so it's right around the same time as this. And then we can also look at there's probably already correspondences starting discussing the Revolutionary Era, which happens about 30 years after this period. So there's probably talk of this already happening in documentation from this time, and I think that's just a way that I can expand this more from like going from the music and opening it up more to looking at these more societal issues and ideas.
I would like to ask, maybe not so much of an academic question, but more personal, Ellis. You play different instruments, and you're amazing in the way you move from one kind of area to another, and you're also like union of confluence of various cultures on your own self. Where is the pipe and tabor passion come from in the middle of all that?
Thank you. Yeah, this has been an interesting journey for me. I guess I was kind of looking for an excuse to learn it. In 2017, I was looking at instruments that were for sale, and one of them was a tabor pipe, and I was thinking about getting it, and then by the time I decided I was going to get it, I have this problem where I'll decide, and then I'll think about it for a day or something like that, and then I go back to it. Somebody had already bought it, so I wasn't able to get it. When I was putting this project together for Rochelle Chasson-Taylor's class on iconography and early music, I started looking at this codex because I'd known about it before, and then I started looking more closely, and I saw that there was these pipe and tabor players, and I was just like, oh, well, maybe this could be my time to actually finally learn how to play the instrument. and do that. So I bought a plastic tabor pipe, and I got a more simple drum, and that I just started experimenting and trying it out and stuff like that. But for me, learning much more about the Peruvian traditions, especially with the pipe and tabor, have really inspired me to learn more on the pipe and tabor. So I really like now learning how to play huayno, for example, which is the most popular genre that I'm familiar with. That's what I grew up listening to, for example. And I want to be able to play that more because that's something that speaks to us more as Peruvians, especially. And I'm also interested in learning like Northern Mexican pipe and tabor traditions that are also quite popular today.
Any other questions? I have one last little thing. You talked about this interesting notion that the pipe and tabor is actually a union of the two sexes in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
But then you also pointed out that the pipe and tabor are actually the union between the two cultures as well.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit, this sort of the bridge building of the pipe and tabor.
Thank you. I think for me, the other aspect that I want to look more into, which I wasn't able to get into for this project, has been looking more at the idea of one musician doing the role of many other musicians. Baroque music in the 18th century was heavily reliant upon multiple musicians. We have very little music that's unaccompanied, very little music that's only for one person, except for salon music of the harp. I'm looking at a keyboard player right here. But aside from like the keyboard works, most of the music was more reliant on collaboration. You almost always needed to have, for example, like to do this music, we needed to have at least 3 musicians. We need to have somebody that can do the text, somebody that can do the bass, and then somebody that can play chords on the bass as well. We do know that there are traditions or different evidence of people doing different kinds of accompaniment on other instruments. For example, the cello, the viol, they were often used to self-accompany and to be able to realize chords, but generally you need this more collaboration in order to do that. And so I've been interested in looking more into like, what does it mean for one musician to have, you know, for example, having a drone and being able to play a melody. So have the rhythm and the drone and the melody happening at the same time by one person rather than collaborating. I also think about how a lot of our Andean music, or traditional Peruvian music, is also very much about collaboration. We always need to have somebody that's a percussionist, always need to have singers, always need to have people that play wind instruments and also the strings as well. And so that versus having just one musician doing this has always been fascinating to me. And I don't really have an answer, but I think it's just another aspect that I want to think more about. Just what's the difference between having one musician doing the role of a community, and is there a selfish aspect to it? Is there a more inviting aspect to it? Is it more of a necessity kind of thing? There's just lots of questions that I have about that, and I do hope to pursue that more in my studies.
Thanks. There are no questions online, but there are many, many compliments on your poncho.
Oh, thank you.
So
thank you.
Thanks very much, Ellis, and thanks again to all your wonderful people working with you on this.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.